Good afternoon, bonjour, assalamu alaikum, mwiriwe neza, General, senior RDF officials, Mr. Senators and members of the representative of the chambers, members of the diplomatic corps, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I greet you in all those languages. My name is Alice Urusaro Karekezi. I'm the moderator of this distinguished panel, of the panelists that I will introduce later, but at the moment I would like to invite them to take their seat on the stage. Mr. Adama Dieng, please. Kano Gilles Rutaremara, please. Dr. Jean-Paul Kimonyo, please. Monsieur Julien Lesourd, je vous en prie. Before I introduce the panel and we start discussing what we are so keen to discuss to this afternoon, and thank you very much for having abandoned all your pilau and all the end of Ramadan today to come and have this conversation with us. I would like to invite the representative of ICRC, Mr. Pascal Couta, to come and to welcome you to this session. Mr. Pascal, please.
Thank you very much. Senators, General, senior representatives of government, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, both here in the hall and those who are following us online, it's an honor, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. The world is urbanizing, and with that, wars are moving into cities and affecting different categories of people, different categories of civilians. It's a massive development over the last few years. So that's one good reason to have the discussion this afternoon. The other one is a good reason to have it here in Kigali, because we would like to bring an African perspective to the discussions, and that's why we have this panel today. We also would like to do it in Kigali because it is a good place, we think, to have policy discussions. Humanitarian work needs a backup. The practical work we're doing in the field needs a policy backup, a policy input. And we find that this is a good place to have it. So we're proud, we're happy that we can do it. And I would like to thank the panelists, some of whom, Mr. Dieng, have traveled very far to be here. I appreciate on this afternoon the presence of all of you on a day which should be off for many of us, including those in attendance here. So thank you for all of you, to all of you for being here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Couta. Without much ado, let me call upon Mrs. Joëlle Germanier, who comes from the headquarters of ICRC in Geneva. Madame Joëlle Germanier.
Senators, generals, distinguished guests, and dear colleagues, it's a real pleasure to be here. I think I will first start to thank our colleague from the delegation in Kigali, who have put lots of energy to have this event, organize this event here tonight, and I'm really glad to see such a full room. So thank you very much for being here, although it's a holiday. I will not take too much of your time, but before giving the floor to Alice, who has kindly accepted to do the moderation tonight, I just wanted to give you a few words, a kind of background information about why the ICRC is doing this year a series of events on war in cities. So it's actually the fourth event, the fourth conference cycle, the ICRC is organizing. So with the first one we had was on new technologies. Then we had another one on the different principles guiding humanitarian action. And last year we focused on how to better generate respect of the law. So this year, 2017, is the year where we decide to speak a bit more, to deepen the subject of war in cities. And let me explain you a bit why we have decided that this thematic needs more attention. So it first started with, so we're organizing this series of events, and beside that we also published an issue in our academic journal that maybe some of you may know, the International Review of the Red Cross, where you will find a series of of articles from very multidisciplinary domains. So you have some urban architects, you have of course academics, diplomats, military, and they all give their own perspectives about what are today the legal and operational challenges when it comes to war in cities. So you can find of course all this information online, and I welcome you to have a look at it. So why war in cities? I think Pascal already quickly introduced the subject, and I think to say it very quickly and easily, we all know that today we are living in a century that is called the century of the city. And as the world is urbanizing, armed conflicts have been urbanizing too. And so this is today a pressing humanitarian challenge that is not only regional but a global one. I would like to share a few figures with you just as an introduction about urbanization today. So already this year we are saying that more than half of the global population is living in cities. And by 2030 we are expecting 2/3 of the global population to be living in cities. We also know that 96% of urban growth is expected to take place in developing countries, in cities that are already facing fragility. Moreover, out of 65 million people who are forcibly displaced, 75 are today living in urban settings. And I guess most significantly, about 50 million people are bearing today the brunt of the consequences of armed conflict. So with those figures, we really think that it is an issue that needs to be tackled. And the more we can do to understand urbanization and the different challenges and complexity, the better we can also adapt our humanitarian response. And I guess there has already been a rising knowledge within the international community that the functioning of the urban system is very specific and needs to be understood as a whole, and also with a multidisciplinary approach. And it's also what we, the ICRC, that's also what we are trying to do. So it's after about 30 years of experience in urban settings, the ICRC has been analyzing the various challenges it represents on a legal and operational aspect. I will not go into depth on that, as we have an expert panel here who will discuss those issues, but just maybe to raise your attention that there were two main concerns that came out of our experience on the ground. The first one being that we really need to reshape our humanitarian action. So how can humanitarian actors adapt to urban needs, which are very different from the rural approach we had in the past? So we will discuss this more into depth with our panel here. And the second concern was more the legal aspect. So how can we better ensure compliance with international humanitarian law, what we also call the laws of wars? How can we ensure that there is more compliance on the ground, and also what are the military challenges when we speak about war in cities, which are quite distinctive than conducting military operation in open rural areas. So to reflect on all those issues and try to find solutions, we really think that we need to talk to each other. We also think that we need to collect more facts, we need to collect more evidence from the ground, and we also need to sit together to discuss those things. And I think that's really one of the aim of having such events as we have here tonight. As I told you, this conference cycle we are doing in 2017, the ICRC, we had already a series of events, so don't worry, I will not summarize them all to you here. But just to give an idea, we had an event in Nairobi, one in Moscow, one in The Hague, one in London. So we're really trying to have kind of a global conversation in order to also have geographical perspective and understand what are also the specific challenge of each region. And that's why we are very glad to have such an event here in Kigali. Just to draw you maybe a few subjects that were discussed in those past events: the protection of civilians in urban warfare, the protection of basic infrastructure, how that is important, the protection of cultural property that we sometimes a bit forget, but is also a challenge to urban warfare, and also us as humanitarian actors, the challenges we face today in gaining access to those places. We are also thinking of having other events, of course, during the year, following the one we have tonight. So just that you know, it's a continuation of debates. And we think that one important one that will come out, for example, will be to speak about urban IDPs, which, of course, is also very relevant to the region here, if we think, for example, of Mogadishu. So here tonight, as we know, the African continent is also faced with those challenges, and we're also seeing a shift from rural to urban armed conflict, a shift that is likely to grow in the near future. So we are very happy to bring another African perspective to this series of debates we have started last year. And we hope tonight that we can draw on lessons learned from current and past events in the region. And so it's a great pleasure of hosting a very distinguished and rich panel tonight, which will bring various perspectives, diplomatic, military, academic, and humanitarian experience from the field. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I will leave the floor to Alice to introduce you to the panel and start this interesting debate tonight. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, after having been updated on the context of our conversation this afternoon, allow me, before I turn to my panelists, to recognize the presence of the representative of European Union among our midst. You are welcome, sir. She has given the tone for the kind of conversation we want to have, and it is obvious that this conversation will require not only one perspective within the African perspective, but different ways to understand what we are faced with today. And to discuss that, we have had the privilege of having a distinguished panel that I will very, very briefly introduce to you, knowing that you have received these flyers. For those of you who haven't received these flyers, please look for them, because I will not read them. I will just say one or two things I know about a panel that I have the privilege to have met before. That will be relevant for our discussion this afternoon. I would like to bring to attention that Mr. Adama Dieng, who is the UN Secretary General's Special Advisor for the Prevention of Genocide, is not exactly what I would call a foreigner to this country, as well as to the issues of armed conflict in this continent. When I first met him in 2000 in Conakry, Guinea, he was coming there to celebrate Guinea, Conakry, for its work for refugees. So he was very much already in international humanitarian law, coming for the right as a senior legal professional, coming for the advocacy of the right of refugees. I've known him as a registrar when he was visiting Rwanda frequently, and I've had the privilege with Dr. Kimonyo to host him at the Center for Conflict Management at the time. So he came to Butare to visit us. He has come several times also. But what is important for us to know is that we are here speaking with somebody who has gone from an advocate of rights in situations of conflict to someone who has had decision-making in International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, as well as dealing with genocide today. So you are most welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Alice. Pascal, thank you indeed. When I got your invitation, it was without hesitation that I accepted. I mean, Rwanda is very close to my heart. And I think this country really today symbolizes what I can call the resilience. But at the same time also, having toured this morning Kigali, which I haven't visited for the last 3 years, I saw such a new city emerging. And I think this is also a sign that one needs to have a strong leadership country with a leader who has a vision. But I think that vision goes beyond really the future of this country, but it covers also the future of the whole of Africa. And as a matter of fact, you may know that President Kagame did produce a very important report for the African Union. But whatever the African Union would do, if it doesn't pay enough attention to prevention, it will fail. And in that regard, I could not but really accept this invitation, whereas Alice and Joel mentioned, we are talking about war in cities. That was in December 2015 when the then Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, and the President of the ICRC, Peter Maurer, made an unprecedented joint warning about the impact of 2 days' conflict on civilians. They asked for urgent and concrete action to address human suffering and insecurity. And just recently, Peter Maurer, the President of the ICRC, stated that he isn't surprised at the new UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres' call for institution-wide UN reforms and a renewed focus on prevention. And we have seen also the ICRC collaborating with the World Bank in famine prevention and mitigation in East Africa. So, therefore, I cannot but really start my keynote address by referring to the title of an op-ed I issued on December 10th, 2015. It is urgent to stop the erosion of the respect for international humanitarian law. And what we intend to do in these few minutes I have been allocated is to share with you some thoughts on the importance of respect for the international humanitarian law in light of the evolving nature of armed conflicts, which more than ever disproportionately impact civilians in urban dwellings. The ongoing violations and disregard of ISL and its devastating impact on the lives of civilians and key infrastructures that sustain their livelihood is a constant reminder for us to do more and ensure respect of ISL for both state and non-state actors to protect civilians. The ongoing conflict in Central African Republic, South Sudan, Burundi, and elsewhere, you can add in the list Nigeria, Cameroon, Somalia, etc., is a grim reminder of human suffering and immense destruction that conflicts entails. Despite the ongoing suffering occasioned by war, rules regulating the conduct of war exist, and they exist in large measure. For example, international humanitarian law, ISL, in short, is one of the oldest branches of international law covering wide range of areas such as treatment of civilians in times of armed conflict, treatment and handling of prisoners of war, permissible means and methods of waging armed conflict, obligation to protect certain kind of properties, environment, among other things. Indeed, Geneva Conventions have received universal acceptance, having been ratified or acceded to by more states than there are members of the United Nations. While in a large measure, ICRC continues to be violated, what is evident is that both states and non-state actors alike are keenly aware of their obligations under ICRC. Historically, states have been the primary subject of international law and duty bearers for its enforcement. However, this approach and understanding has changed over the years, especially in light of the achievement made in the progressive development of international law. Key branches of international law, such as international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international criminal justice, their compliance is no longer limited to sovereign states. Rather, they also require individual compliance. Just like states, individuals are full subject of international law, and when norms and rules are violated, especially in times of conflict, perpetrators are individually accountable for their violations. I just returned from DRC, where I reminded the stakeholders who are talking about the violence in the Kasai, about their responsibility and the need to hold accountable those who are orchestrating that violence, and reminding also the authorities that they have law and order, they are in charge of law and order. But as ICRC has demonstrated over the years, and especially through this timely initiative of war in cities, the methods and weapons of warfare have changed tremendously. Today, conflicts are no longer limited to bushes and peripheral. Conflicts are increasingly waged in urban settings and with devastating consequences for the urban dwellers. Key infrastructures essential for livelihood, like water systems, health facilities, education, and business establishment, get destroyed. Further, weapons employed are no longer limited to conventional weapons. Rather, explosive weapons, suicide vests, among many others, are now part of the norm rather than an exception. All these developments require changes in our strategic thinking how to meaningfully confront them. Nowhere the sobering reality of modern-day conflicts is prevalent than Africa. Most of the ongoing conflicts not only have they taken toll on innocent civilians, especially women and children, but have also demonstrated the lethal and indiscriminate nature of weapons being used. Today, it is no longer states that are exclusively engaged in armed conflicts. Participation of non-state actors in African conflicts continue to present serious challenges to the ICRC as the primary legal framework to regulate conduct of hostilities. Rebel groups, some with undefined objectives and command, play a central role in the fighting. Ensuring that these rebel groups adhere to the universally accepted norms regulating hostilities is increasingly difficult. However, looking back, efforts have been made before to ensure that both state and non-state actors adhere to ICRC, including through unilateral declarations, statements of commitment, African Union resolutions, integration of ISL into the armed groups' military doctrines, etc. Through these arrangements, parties managed to have fair treatment of civilians and prisoners of wars, safe corridors for the delivery of humanitarian assistance, and safe passage for the wounded. Indeed, the Constitutive Act of the African Union has made the respect for the ISL an integral part of its policy in addressing prevalent armed conflicts and violence on the continent. The fact that methods and means of waging conflicts are evolving quickly, it is also important to note that international law has evolved and recognized the centrality of accountability. Today, individual accountability for the violation of ISL is an integral part of international law body. And as the former registrar of the ICTR, a Security Council mandated body established to render justice as a result of gross violations of ISL in Rwanda, I believe that a strong accountability framework that recognizes the centrality of the suffering of victims should be a firm component of our efforts in addressing the changing landscape of ISL violations. Where accountability was exercised for the violations of ISL, we agree that, imperfectly as it may be, it has contributed to the respect of ISL and provided ground for our future efforts. Some of you in this room were astutely involved in the efforts to negotiate and adopt the Rome Statute. And today we have seen warlords and commanders who are being put on notice. And again, these efforts may not immediately stop the ongoing carnage, but we see strong international commitment in recognizing and addressing ISL violations. In these brief remarks, let me reiterate my appreciation for these important initiatives being spearheaded by my friends at the ICRC. What we are parts of Syria, Iraq, Yemen, to simply show that this issue of warring cities is not something, of course, peculiar to Africa, but also, unfortunately, it is a serious issue in other parts of the world. And what we are seeing is that in a modern-day urban warfare, where lives and infrastructures have been destroyed beyond human imaginations, while lives are lost, we have to ask ourselves, what happens to the next generation? Who and how will they sustain their livelihood? This development completely deprives citizens of their countries right to legitimately claim and shape their future. And I believe that War in Cities initiatives by ICRC is a timely endeavor. It provides us a framework of conversation on the primary obligation of warring parties in hostilities to observe and enforce universally recognized principles of ISL. It is only when we put lives of the people at the centrality of protection and accountability that we can truly contribute to the ultimate goal of ensuring that warring parties in conflict respect the basic tenets of universally recognized principles of international law. And I cannot conclude without saying that what we have been witnessing in recent days in cities like Bamako or in Mogadishu, elsewhere, the level of violence we are seeing command us to really maybe also think about how to organize the cities in this today's world. And I'm glad that in this panel we have an eminent expert who will look into that dimension. But first and foremost, I think what is critical is that there be a recommitment of member states to ensure the respect of IHL. Unfortunately, what we have seen is that today, even powerful countries have been violating IHL in conflicts around the world. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Special Advisor, for this keynote address. You hinted at the distraction beyond imagination of infrastructure, and this gives a good introduction to our second panelist, Mr. Julien Lesourd, who is an environmental engineer with 20 years professional experience in water and wastewater project. Mr. Lesourd is currently working with ICRC, Regional Delegation Nairobi, for the implementation of large water supply infrastructure in African conflict-affected cities. We want to see with him, from a multidisciplinary thing, what it implies for the cities, the city physical part of the cities, and in the aftermath, how do we address those problems as well? Please.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Maybe I will start first with a short video. If you can start. Sorry, maybe the video will come later. So maybe I'll just start with my presentation. I just made a couple of slides that will just try to present you generally a bit what are we talking when we are speaking about urbanization, how the conflict expresses in Africa. Then after, I'll just present a bit what our teams of engineers in ICRC are doing, which kind of projects we are doing, especially related to water infrastructures. And also after, maybe the longest part will be the challenges we meet during the project implementation. Is it on? That's the video. So this was roughly presenting a bit what I'm going to present a bit more in detail. Maybe if you can start with slide number 1. All right. So the first things I wanted to show you is a few graphs. As engineers, I like when there's a bit of figures and graphs in my presentations. This is just showing these three graphics show that basically the bulk of the population growth will take place in Africa in the coming years. That most of this growth will take place, maybe so the upper one is just showing the growth of population per region, while this graph here with not so clear colors show that most of the population growth will take place in cities. Currently, Africa is the least urbanized continent, but it is steadily catching up. And we can see from the final graph here that in fact the urban population is expected to double within the next 25-30 years. We are talking around, I think it's like 500 million people, so it's really a tremendous number of people. It's a very big challenge. Already we see that providing adequate services to the population in urban areas is a big challenge. So what about the countries which are, and the urban centers which are affected by conflict? That's maybe what I'm trying to show with the next graphs or images. Just to show maybe for the, the one that is here, basically the surface in red here is Juba in 2003. While the blue one is Juba in 2015. So 12 years after, I think we can say that the size of the city has maybe tripled. The same here, we can see the population growth in Goma exponentially since the mid-90s. So we see that, I mean, the conflict doesn't stop the urbanization. Maybe somehow it worsens it. Just the last thing here with it's a bit less focused on war, but this small map of Western Africa is just showing that when we are talking about urban centers, it's not only the big capitals or the cities with millions of inhabitants, but it's also a large number of smaller urban centers, which in general are also more struggling to cope with the demands as they are, let's say, not as central. They receive less attention, less capitals. It's also part of the challenge for urbanization. The few dates I've put here is in Africa, some of the contexts where ICRC has been involved, and we can see that most of these conflicts have been protracted, lasted for a very long time, let's say around 30 years for Somalia, DRC almost the same. In South Sudan, there's been somehow, I could say, around maybe maximum 20 years of peace in the last 60 years. So it's places where conflicts last very long. Maybe I just wanted after to build a bit on the specificities of the African cities and how conflict is resented there. We have, I've just put a small list of the specificities. Historically, I mean, African cities are in general fairly recent, and therefore we see it also, I mean, even in peaceful countries, it has been a challenge to meet the development of the infrastructures as the urbanization has been quite fast and not like more maybe in European, Asian countries where the development of the cities was much more progressive. Also here the conflict, I have to say that, and that's the two pictures that are under showing Aleppo in Syria and Juba in South Sudan. The conflict in general in African cities, in the African continent, sorry, doesn't happen directly in the cities. I mean, there's still a lot of the direct fighting that goes in the rural areas. But the impact of the conflict on the cities is very indirect. So it's more like displacement of population, economic crisis, the reduced power of the authorities. Same the infrastructures, as I was mentioning. Already in quite a number of cities, even at peace, the infrastructures are not very well developed. We can see it in slum areas in many towns and cities on the continent, that the facilities are not very well developed, and the impact of the conflict sometimes is a bit of looting. Also, in terms of the effect on the authorities, there's lack of capacity of the authorities to maintain and develop the infrastructures, especially in conflictual context, through the lack of finances, the skills of the employees going away, lack also of power on the populations. Also here for the population, maybe specificities, that's quite a number of places people are still living, I would say, on semi-rural lifestyles. It's not that everybody is already used on having all the basic services, essential services directly at home. People still sometimes, even in cities, have to walk to fetch water and things like that. So it's also a kind of resilient populations, but still with having impacts on the health and economic burdens. Maybe just now moving a bit on ICRC activities. The first graph here is just to show a bit what it represents in terms of expenditures. There's around 40 million Swiss francs that are spent every year on water projects. A bit more than this. I think we are reaching around 27 million that are spent in urban settings, but we can see that just a small part of it is spent in Africa. We can see it also from the map down there. The bulk of the expenditures are for projects in the Middle East because of the reasons that I mentioned also earlier, is that people there are more dependent on the infrastructures they were more developed. The conflict happens directly in the towns and where services collapse. In terms of the kind of projects we're implementing, just the various types, so it can range from emergency projects like water trucking, temporary structures directly to bring water to needy populations, but also rehabilitation of existing facilities. And what is very often also happening, as I showed in Juba, which grew very quickly within 12 years, we also have to work on developing new facilities. And then we also have some other type of projects which are more linked like to training, some development of master plans and so on. The large, when I'm speaking about large projects for ICRC, large infrastructure projects for water, it's typically project that would cost like between 1 or 5 million Swiss francs over a period lasting for 2 to 5 years for implementation. Here I'm just having quickly a few pictures. I don't know if they're showing very well pictures for some of our activities. So that's for example an emergency water treatment plant that was implemented in Juba during cholera outbreaks. That's the construction of a new pumping station in Goma. Here, that's some old pumps in Maiduguri, Nigeria, that we are planning to change. And this is in central Bangui, a main pipeline that has been replaced. So that's the kind of projects that we're implementing. So in the implementation of these projects, we are facing first as engineers, we are coming and we have to provide water to the people. The first challenges that we are meeting are technical challenges. Rather than detailing my passion about how to change a pump or how to replace a pipeline, I just try to group these things in some more broad concept. So the challenges that maybe internally already we feel, like having sufficient HR in context where it's difficult to staff the position well, how to implement the projects, it's sometimes difficult in conflict-affected context to find contractors, some people who can do the work, so sometimes we have to do it ourselves. It's also, logistics are also complicated. And we also are facing other type of technical challenges more linked to the context and situations where they are. I've mentioned, for example, the lack of information on the existing systems, no baseline data, no information about what has been done, because very often system dates from decades ago. And the last point maybe where I wanted to insist is a bit the contradiction between what I would call urgent and post-conflict measures, meaning that there are some projects, typically water trucking, is providing water straight away to the population, but it has absolutely no sustainability. And from the moment we stop funding it, well, people are in the same situation as before. And on the other hand, we would like sometimes to implement measures for building a new water treatment plant or things like that. And these are projects which take a lot of time to implement between the studies, the works and so on. And so we always have a bit to balance on how to be able to meet the needs that are immediate and also to pave way to have sustainable solutions. Once even these technical challenges, somehow we're managing to meet them, we also reaching another, I would say, layer of challenges. It's just that once we manage to build a proper water supply facility, providing water to the people, how do we make sure that it will still work in the next 6 months, 6 years, or 20 years? So in this regard, that's where we are meeting operational challenges to ensure that the operation of the system is sustainable and can last as long as possible. So we have elements like ergonomy to design, and that's part maybe of the technical challenges, but to design the systems to make sure that they are resilient, also simple enough to resist some problems. There are also, after the problem of the people who are going to operate the system, the number of employees, their skills, if they are enough, the knowledge, if they have tools and so on. Monitoring systems to be able to follow up the evolution of the systems. And a big part of it is also how do we cover operational costs. Most systems run when there is no power on generators. They need chemical products to be able to process the water. And here I've ranged a bit like 4 criteria from the very basic thing of people being able to pay the salaries of the operators and the fuel to run the generator. After a bit more of maintenance regularly, then after replacement of the systems, and maybe sometimes even being able to invest for replacement or for new projects and things like that. In our context, it varies a lot depending on the countries we are working in. It's sometimes we are trying to avoid being in the daily operation, because then we are just completely substituting ourselves to any kind of operator that would come afterwards. And the last point also I wanted to mention, this part is, what I mentioned earlier is more part of the water company or water institution that will operate the systems. We also have the ownership and the behavior of the beneficiaries who have to treat the systems with respect. Now, In order also to ensure that these operations are undertaken in a proper, conducive environment, now we are reaching even another layer, which is more linked to organizational challenges. I have to say here we are a bit leaving the field of specialty from the engineers, where we are much more comfortable in dealing with the technical matters. Operation goes a bit, and then after we also have all the organizational problems. So, for example, to know what's the institutional framework, how the services are supposed to be organized in the country when you still have a state and things like that, authorities that are functioning. What's the policies? Should the people pay for the water? Is it subsidized by the states? Things like that. What's the, I was saying, ownership business model? There's also the capacity of the authorities regarding the capacity to implement the decisions, integrity, the knowledge and the skills. And the last thing I also wanted to mention in this regard is a bit the coordination between, let's say, the agencies providing aid. We are very often in contexts where the authorities are so desperate to be able to provide water to the people that they are accepting anybody that comes with a proposal. They are saying yes. Sometimes it can create duplicates and things like that. That's why sometimes in ICRC we've been involved in the development of master plans. Although it sounds to be something very developmental, it also helps the authorities after to coordinate the intervention of the various agencies. Also the coordination between donors and between the authorities themselves when they have different agencies working, some, for example, for the water resources and others for the water supply and things like that. I'm just realizing I had forgotten to pass. That was the fourth slide, sorry. Now, just to finish maybe, in terms of conclusion, I just wanted to repeat a bit the main points of what I said. So the urban infrastructures in conflict context is a really growing problematic. I think it's really a very big challenge for the next years. Meeting this growing urban population in Africa, even in peaceful context, I think it's going to be somehow difficult. So in conflictual context, it's going to be a very big challenge. ICRC has quite some experience in it. And the second part, so I wanted to mention, I did this small pyramid where, I mean, as an engineer, the bulk of our work was these technical problems, then there is the operation problems, then there is the organization problem. And the question for me is somehow how deeply we should be involved in these problems. Should we consider that, well, you know, it's humanitarian emergency measures and that we fix the pump and we don't care afterwards on how it's going to be operated, on how far we could go up and try to work even on the institutional levels. So that was the thing. And the last one that I wanted to mention, everywhere we are hearing water is life. That's true, but there are also some other services which are considered to be essential, such as, for example, health structures. For this, ICRC is quite active. But also maybe power supply, as most of our facilities there rely on this. We start to be a bit involved in power supply projects more in the Middle East, but also after sanitation, transport, education. Mr. Dieng also mentioned them. Right. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lesourd, for having opened our eyes to very obvious problem, but most of the time less discussed in the gatherings like this. I'm sure people will have many questions. Now I would like to welcome Kano Gilles Rutarimara, our third panelist, who is the director of Rwanda Peace Academy. Kano Rutarimara, as the flyer shows you, wears many hats. He has been an active soldier, and he has also held positions of more civilian positions both in the Rwanda Defense Forces as well as in the Ministry of Defense. And now he's also providing academic leadership for pre-deployment training in peace support operations. He has known firsthand those kind of warfares that we are speaking about, and after having a very practical insight in terms of engineering, I hope you will also help us think how the warfare we are witnessing today is transforming and what it implies for us in terms of thinking, but as well in terms of responses. Help me welcome Kano Gilles Rutarimara. Thank you.
Given the diversity of officials who are here, I will just say all protocols observed so that I don't jangle up your protocols. We're actually given an overarching theme for this conference, but we are not given any specific topic to discuss. So it was up to everybody to get his or her topic. And my topic is contemporary armed conflicts in cities, nature, implications, challenges, and the way forward. So I will briefly talk about the changing nature of armed conflict, its implications, expected international humanitarian law or IHR principles and rules, then the challenges as well as the way forward. So during World War I and II, as well as Cold War era, wars were fought mainly between states. They were also fought across wide and open battlefields, largely in the countryside. Cities were sieged instead of being attacked directly. The 21st century has witnessed a shift of wars from the countryside to cities such as Mogadishu in Somalia, Tripoli in Libya, Bangui in Central African Republic, to mention a few examples. So these contemporary wars are characterized by the following. One, they are fought between regular state armed forces and non-state armed groups, or even between non-state actors or non-state entities alone. Two, they are intrastate and are fought in urban areas with varying levels of development. I'm not sure whether in some areas qualify to be cities, but they are urban centers with varying levels of development. Three, there is a significant disparity or asymmetry between military strength and technological capabilities of the belligerent parties. So they don't have same capabilities. Four, the so-called stronger party in the context of wars in African cities lacks advanced intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, as well as other technological capabilities. So even what we regard sometimes as a superior power is lacking in a number of things. Five, the belligerents are organized and structured and have different ideologies, motivations, and interests. And six, the wars that are fought are as diverse and complex as the belligerents and the cities in which they are fought. So what are the implications of these wars in cities? One, because they are fought largely in urban settings that are relatively densely populated and not easy to fight through, the hostilities result in high civilian casualties and in high casualties on the side of the belligerent parties. Two, the wars also result in damage or destruction of civilian objects, including critical infrastructure, disrupting essential services such as water, electricity, and medical, that have a direct or indirect impact on human life and livelihood. And three, because of asymmetrical nature of military power, the weaker party in terms of military strength and technological capability usually, but not always, employs unconventional means and strategies such as using civilians as human shields and mingling with the civilian population as a survival tactic. This tempts the opposing force to hit back, and in most cases, resulting in heavy loss of civilian life, thus undermining compliance with international humanitarian law. Fourth, lack of advanced intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities also limit a party's ability to carry out disciplined operations, such as intelligence collection and proper targeting. And five, there seems to be overgeneralization while discussing wars in African cities because they share some similarities. But I must warn here that there are variations in the nature and level of development of cities and in motivations, interests, and military capabilities of the belligerent parties. This makes the war in cities very complex in nature. It also calls for detailed and specific analysis of individual wars in African cities rather than lumping them together as one. So what are the expected international humanitarian law principles and rules? I'm bringing these ones out because these are principles and rules over which militaries are judged. So they are expected standard principles and rules contained in international humanitarian law against which the planning and conduct of hostilities are judged. These standards are aimed at ensuring protection of civilian and civilian objects. Here, civilian objects, I mean any object that is not a military objective. One of these principles is observing the rule of distinction. This is meant to distinguish between civilian and military targets. That is between combatant and non-combatant targets, and also to avoid indiscriminate attacks. Verification is supposed to be done to ensure that prospective targets are indeed military objectives, but this requires one, verification of military objectives in good time, evaluation of accuracy and reliability of target information, and detailed assessment of the number and location of both civilian and civilian objects surrounding the prospective military objective. Principle number 2 is about observing the rule of proportionality. This takes into account the following elements. 1, location of civilian and civilian object in relation to military objective. 2, accuracy of weapons, whether they are precise or imprecise, and the nature of weapons, whether they are lethal or non-lethal. It also takes into account the nature of military objective and the consequences resulting from its attack. For example, if you are attacking a bridge, is it likely to lead into floods in case it is destroyed? These are some of the considerations that are supposed to be taken. So this also brings into light the means and methods of warfare. The means and methods of warfare should be proportionate to military objective. Inappropriate weapons that have wider photo and destructive impact zones, such as using heavy aircraft bombs and missiles, indirect fire weapon system like mortars and artillery, as well as explosive weapons, are, according to ICRC, to be avoided. Specific methods of warfare, for example, against persons, are also prohibited. For example, the use of human shield, and also sexual violence as a method of warfare. The same applies to specific methods of warfare against objects such as pillage and unnecessary destruction of environment. Third principle is taking feasible precautionary measures. This requires careful selection and verification of targets, cancellation or suspension of an attack where necessary, dissemination of warnings before an attack, and lastly, not locating military objectives in populated areas. These principles are associated with some challenges. What are these challenges? First of all, let me mention that explaining the challenges in planning and the conduct of military operations in cities is not to justify the failure in complying with international humanitarian law. Rather, it helps us to understand the factors that undermine compliance with international humanitarian law. What are these challenges? 1, accurate and timely identification of military objectives is dependent on intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, as well as other technological advancement, which are often lacking in the African context. 2, some prospective military objectives may be in close proximity to protected persons and civilian objects. This collocation makes indiscriminate attacks more likely, but of course not necessarily justifiable. 3, wrong choice in selection of weapons, indirect fire weapons and cluster munitions that have big photo and destructive impact. These, as I said, are not to be used. 4, low precision due to the use of unguided weapons is a challenge because you are likely to hit wrong targets. 5, disorganized and unplanned cities with high population and poor infrastructure, and in most cases with no elaborate maps. This is also another challenge. So fighting here is likely to result in high number of civilian casualties, and humanitarian operations will also be difficult to conduct. 6, unconventional and inappropriate means and methods of warfare that tempt the opposing force to react inappropriately. For example, those that make it difficult to distinguish between combatants and civilians. This is another challenge. Challenge number 7, belligerents are required to give a warning and to allow civilians to protect themselves unless this would undermine the operation. However, there are some challenges associated with giving warning in military operations. 1, some targets may be time sensitive because they pose an immediate threat or because they constitute high value but fleeting military objectives that may be lost if not immediately attacked. This may be a lost opportunity in the military. 2, it's difficult to avoid conducting surprise attacks when a belligerent party does not have advanced intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets. This is because ICRC assets that reduce the importance of element of surprise as a necessity of war are in most cases lacking. So it is usually the more developed the army is in terms of capability, the more it can afford to relax surprise attack. So lack of advanced intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets and technology also leads to some inabilities. For example, it's known that when you fight during the day in urban cities, many people are likely to die. So the armies or the militaries that are able to fight at night are those that have these assets. So they will definitely choose to fight during the night instead of going into streets during the day. 8, belligerents, another challenge is belligerents who are unaware or have little awareness of international humanitarian law and the consequences of not respecting it. Ninth challenge is lack of clear and well-articulated rules of engagement, context-specific operational orders, and disciplinary codes of conduct incorporating various international humanitarian law principles. And 10, lack of a clear understanding of political objective. For example, why raise down a city when tomorrow you will need it? You may find there is a gap when it comes to political objective. Way forward, the following should be done to ensure protection of civilian objects, including critical infrastructure. One is selecting the appropriate means and methods of warfare. 2, training in international humanitarian law is an imperative because it helps shape the planning and conduct of operations, as well as understanding the penalties or sanctions for non-compliance. 3, unconventional and inappropriate means and methods of warfare that tempt the opposing force to react inappropriately should always be analyzed properly before taking an action and should be emphasized in all IHL trainings. 4, civilians should be encouraged and assisted to develop and refine strategies to protect themselves. 5, the belligerent forces should always work closely with various partners and in particular humanitarian actors and experts in urban matters, especially those in cities experiencing conflict. 6, international humanitarian law should be domesticated and all incorporated in national legislations, defense policies, military doctrine, disciplinary codes of conduct, and various military manuals. 7, while the defense policy and various legal instruments may be clear on international humanitarian law, there is need to have clear and well-articulated rules of engagement and context-specific operational orders. 8, appropriate action should be taken against members of armed forces and armed groups in case of crime or grave misconduct in violation of international humanitarian law. 9, which is the last, lessons learned, good practices and policies on mitigating civilian harm in urban combat should be shared with the view to adopting those that are relevant and context-specific. In conclusion, despite their differences in ideology, motivation, interests, and military capabilities, the attacking and defending parties should always ensure maximum protection of civilian objects, including critical infrastructure. I thank you.
Thank you, Kano, for having discussed the issues of changing phases of war, methods and means, and the implication for training and conduct during and after conflict. Because he has opened the door and the window for a more political understanding, because all those changes also bring other dimensions. And I think this is a good introduction for our last, but not the least, panelist, Dr. Jean-Paul Kimonyo. Dr. Jean-Paul Kimonyo is a Rwanda expert on conflict and post-conflict reconstruction, senior advisor on NEPAD, that you know all, Office of the President in Rwanda. He's also an author. He has written on those changing methods of wars, and particularly he has taken a point that is not yet discussed here very much, the point of actors of war, because we have spoken about civilians as a greater target. But his first book on popular participation in the context of genocide discuss in depth how people who are not non-state actors, but not organized groups only, but individuals and groups who have not killed before, involved in the warfare. He has also, he has just written a book on Rwanda's post-genocide reconstruction entitled Rwanda Transform or Perish, that is published at the Kampala edition from next month. So without much ado and anticipating on what he wants to do, he has sent me a very intriguing title. I want him to develop on that, taking his political scientist lenses. Please help me welcome Dr. Jean-Paul Kimonyi.
Thank you, Alice, for the very nice presentation. Maybe I should just precise that here I'm talking about on my own capacity, not at all. I'm not talking about. I'm not talking or speaking on behalf of my employer. I'm talking here more as an expert than the civil servant that I am. Alice, I'm going to throw the ball back to you. When I came, Alice asked me, do you stand by your title? I say yes. Why? So I think that the title maybe was a bit radical for her liking. But I stand by it, and for very serious reasons. She talked about my work, the work I did on Rwanda, but some of these conclusions, or the conclusions that I'm going to present you today, are also drawn from experience and quite detailed study in Burundi for more than a year on the conflict in 2005 when it was the first election of the first post-conflict election in Bujumbura. And another almost a year or so in Abidjan in 2009, just before the war broke out again. But beside those examples also, I guess I'm following what's happening in Africa, like all of us. So the title is not here, but I think that you can see the title on the leaflets. I'm talking about the emperor's nakedness of electoral solution to urban warfare. My presentation will draw a bit on what has been said about infrastructure and the evolution of cities in Africa. And let me just read out what I've prepared. African cities are under tension, and this tension is increasing. After celebrating Africa Rising, we're talking more and more about Africa uprising. Since 2005, the number of protests, riots, has multiplied by 10, and most of them has taken place in cities. In fact, Africa is entering a new zone of urban turbulence after the waves of revolt that led to the independence and those that in the late 80s and beginning of 90s brought the wave of democratization on the continent. The cause of these revolts are, of course, poverty, but also unsanitary environments and failure in the supply of public services like electricity and water. But there is also behind those revolts an element of social class confrontation. The bulk of the protesters are often members of a kind of urban lumpen proletariat, usually mobilized by people from the middle class, but for only partially overlapping motives. African cities are growing rapidly. The rate of urbanization in 2010 was 46, and is expected to reach 50% by 2050, a very rapid change, as our first presenter explained very well. While well-managed urbanization is an opportunity for economic development, what we are seeing in Africa is rather the expansion of slums, impoverishment, and rising inequality. But Africa cities are also are not only divided by social class. They are often composed of more or less homogeneously segregated neighborhoods according to ethnicity, region, or religion. This segregation is often a microcosm of the division that the country is subject to. The more the country is divided and unstable, the more the city, especially the capital, will be segregated. This social division and identity serve as a breeding ground for revolts, riots, and urban war. Finally, there's an episode is particularly favorable to the explosion of violence, that is elections. Even in countries that are more or less stable, in the time of election, there is more and more a fear of an eruption of violence. This is the case for the election in Nigeria, to a less extent in Ghana, and I think most of us are holding our breath for Kenya. In fragile countries emerging from conflict, elections are often the occasion for a lapse into violence and destabilization. Think here of Côte d'Ivoire, DRC, or Burundi. Capital cities are often the place where this violence begins, this violence related to elections. The centers of power are there, and the belligerents live close to each other. The more African cities develop, the more likely they are to become important centers of political and military confrontation. Yet, systematically, the international community, the AU, and African elites choose election as the ultimate tool for conflict resolution. These elections are supposed to bring legitimacy to the winner and to the conclusion of the peace process. These actors systematically insist that this election be as competitive as possible, despite the obvious political polarization with identity undercurrents. On the part of local actors, it's often a matter of ensuring that the power is monopolized in the event of victory. In this, they are often supported by the international actors who like political clarity. Processes of power sharing often do come only once the harm is done. Or even worse, elections were meant in the first place to undo the existing ones. With the disillusionment that is beginning to settle, elections clearly become a pretext for withdrawal of peacekeeping forces, as has been seen in Central Africa. In non-decision-making circles, the awareness of the pragmatic nature of election in fragile settings is well advanced. But in official forums, up to the Security Council, they still serve as the default choice for conflict resolution. African populations themselves are ambivalent about this issue. On the one hand, they passionately participate in electoral contests, but more and more, between them, this population express their mistrust. Emerging citizen movements distance themselves from political parties and even NGOs, focusing instead on everyday problems that they think electoral winners won't care much about, like the issue of power cuts or water supply. But they also end up being caught up in the electoral torrents. Once the fever has fallen, more and more Africans see election as an exercise that brings little change into their life. So what to do? Should we then do without elections? Certainly not. The alternative, autocracy, is not a solution that is neither acceptable in principle nor effective in practice. More often, in the first place, conflicts arise from the challenge to autocratic powers. I will here modestly suggest three things. The first is, in the case of fragile society, a deconstruction of too far-reaching democratic precepts. Here, it is a question of dropping some of the ideological tenets by formally acknowledging the problematic character of electoral processes in a situation of fragility. It is a question of removing the issue from reports written by experts to address it in international fora, including at the African Union. The aim is not to repudiate election in peace-building processes, but rather to reduce their importance as mechanisms to resolve conflict and to seek to accompany them by measures that reduce their dangerousness. It is, above all, a question of moving away from the competitive dimension of election and instead focusing on processes of power sharing that should be almost permanently entrenched. That was the case in many European countries after the Second World War, when ideological differences were too strong and national consensus too weak. They had understood at the time that competitive elections without strong national consensus is a recipe for big problems. The aim will be to revisit the shift in reasoning, which in the euphoria of the fall of the Berlin Wall decreed that there were no longer any precondition for the establishment of democracy in any society. For humanitarian actors, while waiting for political bodies to reconsider the position, it is a question of turning the relationship between election and protection of population on its head. Instead of being taken as a benchmark to start reduce protection of population, they should be taken as what they really are, as red flags that signal the need for strengthened protection in the short and medium term. Finally, for the communities and local organizations, they should not be carried out by the electoral favors and see in them, yes, an opportunity, but also a danger. They should engage in dialogue processes, confidence building, and mutual protection mechanisms before elections. These mechanisms should focus primarily on the control of young men. These local action should, of course, be based on the most important social fault line, such as ethnicity or religion. Every time a crisis breaks out, we hear experts explaining that the conflict is not about identity, it's about politics. Of course, it is true. But once violence has broken out, often it is only a matter of time before political entrepreneurs manage to mobilize supporters using the easiest tools, that is identity and the prospect of looting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kimonyo, for bringing this much-needed political lens in that discussion, and particularly for highlighting the paradox of more than a decade of observing polarization and electoral violence happening in cities mostly, and election being at the same time steadily considered as a tool for conflict management without even revisiting the issues. Here, my role would be really to turn to the audience. We started pretty late, and I would not want to use my prerogative of moderator for teasing out questions. Rather, if time allows, I'll come back to them. But at this point, I would really want to hear the audience on what I suspect are many questions. Briefly speaking, Mr. Dieng has spoken very much on the issue of prevention. As we have been told by Monsieur Le Sourd, we have a growth of population in urban settings that is just flying. And in view of that, we really need to think seriously on what prevention means, since we have observed so much violence happening in our cities, in the different places he has evoked. And the hot places, the hot spots, you know them. And he has spoken also about individual compliance vis-a-vis of international humanitarian law. Maybe we'll come back to that, and we look forward to hear about it. Mr. Le Sourd has brought up some of the blurring role of current reconstructors that are very much moving from humanitarian to more development issues. Because when you speak about water plant, water sanitation, you are speaking about state infrastructures that are traditionally provided by the state and that require long-term and also an existing infrastructure. I'm sure you'll have many questions about that as well. We have heard the prescriptions that Kano Rutarimara have given in the face of changing wars, and particularly a dilemma he has pointed out of the fact that having wars in the cities transform also civilians sometimes to a human shield that belligerents use. So what does it mean in terms of thinking about that, in terms of domesticating international humanitarian law in that place? And perhaps we will hear him also about the protection of civilians. Kigali has just hosted the Kigali Principles of Protection of Civilians. We would like to know if this can be extended much more and come and find a place in this discussion of wars in cities. And yes, so I really look forward to your questions. I think you have many of them. We'll have 25 minutes to 30 minutes maximum before inviting you to the cocktail that is desperately waiting for you outside of this room. But before that, please feel free to share with us. I'm going to take a lot of very brief, I hope, and I will use my prerogative of moderator this time to stop you when needed. But please briefly introduce yourself and state your question in terms that we can all understand. I will take the first 5 interventions and give to the floor. You are welcome to ask questions. Yes? Yes, do you have a question? Yes? We can start by you. And then General I'll take them from the... Yes, please.
Thank you very much. We are really enlightened by your presentations. The question I have is about the collective condemnation.
Excuse me?
My name's Ndahaya Karist. I'm an advocate, and I'm a former participant in All African Humanitarian Law in Arusha. So my question goes to, actually wars has not been shifted to urban areas, rather there has been dramatic and consistent development of urban areas. So my question goes to the prevention part of, so I will direct it to Doctor. Usually we have use of some munitions or weapons that are...
Briefly, please.
Sorry?
Right to the point.
Yeah, the point is, on prevention, has there been any condemnation or application of some sanctions or like embargoes on states that are producing weapons which are not good, which are indiscriminate in the attacks? For instance, there is use of cluster munitions in Aleppo, Syria, and this has been used, and it is one of the weapons that actually violate the IHL. So is there any step or measures that has been adopted to actually stop the production of these weapons, or rather there has been only the book that condemns, rather than also going to the prevention part by stopping the production of those weapons which inflict to the civilian population? I thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, please. This row, I'll start by you and then General Kazura.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me to contribute from the floor. I'm Richard Moncrief. I'm the Central Africa Director for International Crisis Group, which is a an international NGO working on conflict resolution and conflict management. I'd just like to follow Dr. Kimonyo, because you talked essentially about conflicts which are generated within cities and how that works and what the dynamics are, which I felt was a very interesting aspect of this. And I want to raise the question of circulation of information and the information environment we're in. Some of it is old and well known, and of course well known in this country, concerning circulation of hate speech. You don't need social media to do that. We've known that for a long time. But some of it is of course new, because we're looking at the very rapid circulation of information and opinion, unmediated, unedited, not going through traditional editorial processes, and circulating on the ground, in particular in urban areas, because the reactions to information and opinion can be much faster in urban areas. And we've seen that very much in many contexts recently. And I think this poses a number of challenges. It would be very interesting to get your views on them. Firstly, of course, there is the challenge of the circulation of perfectly legitimate political opinion on social media. Then there is the circulation of inflammatory opinion and hate speech. And of course, as we know, there is a work to try to distinguish between those two things. Then we've seen the circulation of evidence. I really, 1 minute, I will go as fast as I can. Then we've seen the circulation of evidence of abuses and evidence of violence on social media. That's another very interesting question. For example, the very inflammatory comments of a Burundian senator in, I believe, December 2015 would not have come out at all if someone had not recorded them on their mobile phone in the meeting. So that's another very important and somewhat new aspect to this. Then we have the issue of fake news, of people fabricating fake news. And finally, we have the issue of denying real evidence of violence and abuses through calling it fake news. And I've been seeing evidence of exactly that in Anglophone Cameroon just recently, but that's just one example amongst many. So a whole series of issues concerning information, how information is feeding into violence in the urban setting, but also can inform us about that violence. So it's not just a negative. And this is an issue where we are balancing opportunities and risks and the negative and the positive of the new information environment. So sorry, a bit of a long comment, but I thought it's quite an important issue to get out there. So I'd welcome any reactions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Yes, sir. Please.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank you very much, to thank the eminent panelists for your excellent presentations. I would wish to first of all say that whatever I would say, I will bring it in the war in cities in an African perspective. And I want to thank Mr. Dieng for having talked about prevention. And on this point, I would think that whatever we are saying here is informed by protection of civilians. Then so far we've seen so many conflicts, and probably we are going to see more conflict in future. Where are we so far with the prevention? Dr. Kimonyo was talking about the different socio-economic and political issues that can be the causes of those conflicts. But how far? What do we do today? We've seen conflicts. We are likely to see conflicts. Are they, this time around, some measures to prevent the conflicts? But again, if the prevention fails, then we see war, and definitely in cities or elsewhere. And I beg to differ a little bit with my brother Kenojil, talking about war shifting from rural areas to urban areas. I would rather say that today, as long as there is war, it will reach the city. I think either it will start in the city itself, Or if it starts outside the city, it will come toward the city because the city is the center of the power, and always the conflict. And maybe as an example, we hear in World War I or II, people would say, we want to capture Berlin, we want to capture Moscow, then Hiroshima and Nagasaki will be bombed to subdue people, because if you capture the city, you have captured the power. So whether we like it or not, therefore, I think we shall see conflict moving either from the urban area, for rural areas to urban cities, or starting from the city itself and continue there. So I would rather think, since either we prevent the war, but if the war is there, how do we, when people are talking about smart cities maybe, how do we factor in the idea of protecting civilians should war in cities occur? Are we going to create some safe areas where the civilians will be going when the conflict erupts? Or are we going to use technology to make sure there is somewhere, in one way or another, we defend our population? How do we protect our civilian in the city, since we know that probably the conflict or war will erupt again? And lastly, maybe, it's about the way forward. Talking about war in cities in African perspectives, I thank very much Kenojil, and he gave us a lot of measures that can help us. But again, we need to see where we are as Africans. If we look at the different issues we are talking about, such as precision, to use conventional means, to use guided weapons, maybe, to be sure that we are getting at our real target we want. Are we going to be able to do it today as Africans? And if we cannot, what do we do? So I think we need to put a lot of efforts on to protect the civilians, first of all, and at least to see if we have seen that war is going to be likely to erupt tomorrow, then how do we build our cities to make sure that somehow, somewhere, we may protect our civilians? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Two more questions.
Thank you.
In the back, yes?
Yes. My name is Emerance Sumulerwa. I'm the legal advisor at ICRC Kigali. Thank you very much for the presentations. My question goes to Kano Rutaremara. In the way forward, you suggested that one of the solutions would be to train civilians for their own protection. While it would be interesting to discuss on exactly how, what such trainings would consist of. My question is rather about the relationship between such a strategy and the principle that primary responsibility when it comes to protection of civilians lies with belligerents, but most especially with states as signatories of different conventions on IHL and as the main actors in international law. So I'm wondering, would it not look like states are throwing away their responsibilities by urging civilians to protect themselves? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Umurerwa. Last question. Yes, Mr. Ndahiro.
May I first thank the panelists for their brilliant presentations. Maybe my question goes to Mr. Dieng and Kano Gilles. in the past, we know what happened in Rwanda, we know what's happening in Burundi, in Cote d'Ivoire, and other countries. Do you mind giving us some contemporary definition of non-state actors, lethal and non-lethal weapons? And I'm asking this because we're talking about protection of civilians as if civilians are always innocent victims. What happens when civilians are villains? We have seen it in this world of technology and the spread of hate speech. I think we need to redraw them up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll turn now to the panel. Some have been comments, but there have been also specific questions. Just to start with Mr. Dieng.
Is it on?
You can start with the last question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, going to the last question, I should say that, as you rightly pointed, there is certainly a need, to revisit some of these issues. And I think the launch of this initiative, the War in Cities, is one. And of course, what we have been seeing, as I was mentioning in my introductory remarks, seeing the wars moving out of the bushes, the peripheral, reaching the urban cities. But this doesn't mean, of course, that the rural areas are, of course, immune of the type of violation we are witnessing today. I mean, Burundi is an example as such. We have seen the violence in Bujumbura at a time when the civil society stood up claiming for more democracy, more respect of human rights, and then the political actors, I'm referring here to the opposition, which was not in the forefront. But what is really, to my view, at stake is also the same what we have seen, for instance, in Cote d'Ivoire. We have had the prolonged protected crisis in Cote d'Ivoire, which came to an end. But there is one dimension, to my view, which still need to be looked upon, so as to prevent the occurrence of another violent conflict in Cote d'Ivoire. That means to strengthen the reconciliation process in that country. But what is, I think, also critical, and which have been raised by you and our colleague from the International Crisis Group, is about the use of the social media. There is no doubt that if you take, for instance, South Sudan, what prompted me, in fact, to visit that country last November was the messages which were circulating through the social media, message of hatred from all parts of the world. And this was really frightening, which led me to make a call to the Security Council after having visited the country, saw on the ground, heard the victims. It was simply shocking. But the Security Council, failed to take I would say, the appropriate action at that time, including imposing an arms embargo on South Sudan. But this also, talking about the arms, bring me to touch upon the first questions. What we are seeing is also how can we make sure that those countries which are providing weapons being used to commit atrocity crimes. I think it is important to remind to those states their responsibility. I did welcome and issued a statement when the Arms Trade Treaty was adopted, the ATT, and particularly Article 6, which forbid states to provide weapons which could be used to commit atrocity crimes, by which I mean genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes. Unfortunately, we are seeing today atrocity crimes being committed in countries like Syria, like Yemen, and elsewhere, and who are providing those arms. Okay, you may tell me that those states which are providing have not ratified that ATT, but I think it is important that one make it really an urgent action. And in that regard, also we have to bear in mind one important aspect. One of the friends here say that we'll see more conflict in the future, and if prevention fails, we will see wars. I think it is important to make a distinction between the prevention of conflict and the prevention of atrocity crimes. I mean, we have seen it in the Balkan. We have seen it in this country, Rwanda. When the genocide of the Tutsis occurred in this country, we had at the time an agreement, the Arusha Agreement, which was adopted already, you remember, and we had also even UN forces on the ground. So the conflict through the process of Arusha was almost, in terms of prevention of conflict, addressed, but we did not address the prevention of the atrocity crimes. And here comes the important dimension of the monitoring of funds and hate speech. Had the international community assumed its responsibility at that time, one would have certainly prevented the occurrence of the genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda. So that is one of the, and the last point is also, we have to realize that today you have more people being killed, you know, in situations where you don't have even an armed conflict. I'm referring to the situation in Latin America, for instance. In this, many urban cities in Latin America are witnessing so much violence. I brought religious leaders from that region in the frame of a global program I have in preventing incitement to violence that could lead to atrocity crimes. But the problem was, what can you do to bring to an halt that violence? And today, what we are seeing in most of the African countries is also the result of a poor governance. It is a result of a poor leadership, a poor governance. I mean, if you count today, I mean, the number of African leaders who could really provide a new punch to make things moving, I mean, maybe you'll have no more than 10. So what does it mean? That means we need to address seriously the issue of governance in this country. The conflict we are facing, we talk about war in cities, the wars is simply due to the exclusion. Exclusion is today very tragic. It is due to corruption. You know, in most of the African countries, corruption is spreading. I mean, we have an African convention to fight corruption. I was privileged to write the first draft and to do the study. But here we are today seeing still corruption. And we need, therefore, also to see how we can really make the civil society to be more strong, more vibrant, instead of seeing the shrinking of the space of that civil society in this country.
Then the question of, since we know that definitely we'll have wars in cities where who has the capital city has the power. So prevention, when we, as General Kazura was asking, are we going to use guided weapons? Do we have the means for that? When we speak about wars in cities, we speak about what prevention will be then in those terms. You hinted at governance and good governance as one way of preventing. Can you address this question briefly, and then we turn to Yes.
You mean the provision of the...
Yes, because it's like a fatality that wars will be in cities. What can we prevent in that case? What protections of civilians? I think that was the question.
Yeah, but I think the first prevention, because, and that's why I was very pleased with the new UN Secretary General, putting prevention at the top of its priority. But also how to link prevention and development. I mean, the UN is, the international community is speaking about the Sustainable Development Goal to reach 2030. The African Union has adopted an ambitious plan talking about 2063. But now, when you see that, that's why, you cannot really close your eyes on the key issue, which is the issue of governance, the issue of having more democracy. Because I just returned from the Kasai, where you have 2,000 young people who have their masters, etc., but who are unemployed. And they become the easy target of corrupt politicians ahead of the election, as he was saying, who will manipulate them, offer them possibly give them arms, promise them tomorrow a better future, and what future? So unless we address seriously the issue of development, linking it with and that's why Secretary John Guterres, when he put his vision on prevention recently, a couple of weeks ago, he expects the member state to really speak, put really in practice both resolutions which have been adopted, the one on the Sustainable Development Goal and also sustaining peace. And that's where, if you have the prevention at the top, linking, you cannot have peace and security if you don't also address development, and vice versa. So, and then that's where you will need some kind of a form of flexibility. But at the top, it is for the people themselves to build their own future. But that future can be built not by using arms, but through other means. But comes the days where, if you don't have an option, you go to rebellion. We saw it in this country. The Rwandan Patriotic Army were finally obliged to use the resource of rebellion, use armed force to free its country. And I hope that we will move out of that cycle, bring to an end that rebellion, but it's not yet over. And it will not be over unless our leaders in this continent assume their responsibility, start talking to each other the language of truth. We cannot accept people to kill their own population. What purpose of having Article 4H of the African Union Constitutive Act would say that the Conference of the Heads of State and Government shall intervene whenever populations are facing the risk of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes. But we see situations where such risk happen. And what was the decision? The AU Peace and Security Council issued, for instance, a communique at a time, asking for the deployment of 5,000 troops. Nothing happened. So that means it is time, I think, for the leadership in this continent to really start by being more serious about their decision. You cannot take decision and simply forget about it. Decisions are taken to be applied, to be implemented.
Thank you very much. I will turn to Dr. Kimonyo with the question of our colleague from ICG on circulation of information, the challenges that they pose.
Thank you. This is a very important and fascinating subject, but it's also evolving very quickly, and it's difficult to see exactly where things are going. But already I think you answer most your own question by pointing to the fact that social media are at the same time liberating and harmful, and they can be both. I'm not going to go back to that. I think you covered that. What I would like maybe to talk about briefly is the issue of physical communities versus virtual communities. And sometimes this difference between the communities that are, let's say, the same community but that has two dimensions, one is physical, another one is virtual, can be also very dangerous. In certain ways, in a painful manner. We can see, for example, during the Arab Spring in Egypt, the Arab Spring in Egypt has been sparked mostly, let's say, or in a big part, through social media. And recently, I was listening to testimony of people from Syria, and these were people who were really engaged in the revolution, quote unquote. And some of them said that they regretted to have started the revolution because they say that their country have been destroyed and they don't see anything good that they got from the revolution. It's quite poignant to hear that. But then the social media also plays a role in that, meaning that social media might give us a false impression of the state of the situation on the ground or of the forces that are facing each other. To a certain extent, I think that the revolution in Egypt maybe was too optimistic. And I think that the multiplying factor of social media can also be misleading and dangerously misleading. That's one thing. Another thing, I will maybe just say a word about prevention of conflict in cities in Africa. We have to be careful. It's true that we see multiplication of riots and protests in cities, but I think we need a careful analysis to know exactly to which extent the countries, Africa is more prone to violence and conflict now, let's say, than 25 years ago. It seems that it's not clear. It seems that, to the contrary, the continent is more at peace. It's more at peace now than 25 years ago or 40 years ago. And I think the issue of circulation of information makes us very sensitive to whatever happened on the continent. That's one thing. But second, the trends that are evolving in Africa, both in urbanization and demographic trends, clearly we're going towards something very big. A very big destabilization of cities and countries, but mostly of cities. It's not sure that yet that it will be a violent conflict, but destabilization almost certainly. And how to prevent that? I think that Adama Dieng said it all, development and governance, but now more than that, to another level. And I think that the pressure that rulers of those cities or those countries are going to face are going to oblige them to step up their game. I just wrote a book, I just finished a book on the reconstruction, and one of the things that people who start, let's say, the liberation of this country had in mind very quickly, at the very beginning, was the issue of transformation. Transformation of a country that doesn't have the basis, the economic basis and social basis to sustain itself, and certainly not the political basis to sustain itself, at least in '94. And they had in mind the issue of transformation, and it's still there. But I think that we're just the first in the pack. I think quite soon, a number of countries in Africa will have to transform or to perish. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn now to Kano Rutarimara. Kano Rutarimara has had a few questions, including the issue of definitions. Yes, I think he has noted them. Please.
Yeah, thank you. Let me first state that some of these words are they are actually used in a legal language as contained in international law. So whereas they may appear that they are English words, they are not necessarily simple English words. And I think lawyers would even do that better than I do, but I will attempt to answer Mr. Tom Ndahiro's question. I think when we talk about Turiso here, we are actually saying it goes beyond achieving a military objective. If we use a lethal weapon, it means that it is something that you use in an attempt to to achieve a military objective. But at least we go beyond that and do more harm even to civilians and so on. So if it has that elasticity of doing beyond what you are supposed to be targeting, then that can be lethal as opposed to a non-lethal weapon in terms of suffering of the people and so on. For example, you can use phosphorus, white phosphorus, you can use uranium. Those are lethal. You may use a weapon which actually does not look like, does not look like being a lethal weapon, but its effect again becomes lethal because of the impact that it will have either on civilian population or on infrastructure. Now, when you talk about, you also raise the issue of state and non-state actors. When you talk about state actors, we are referring to actually those that are related to the sovereign state, those that are related to the sovereign state. But when we say non-state actors, we are talking about, for example, it may be a rebel group, it may be a militia, but it has nothing to do with the qualitative. It's not qualitative, but it is something that is not structured under the state. So it can be like a rebel group, it can be an organized group, it doesn't have to be called a rebel group, it can be a militia group. All those are referred to as non-state actors. On General Kazura, I think General Kazura was a comment, it was not a question. I agree with the prevention. It's supposed to be a priority, but unfortunately, the situation that is currently prevailing is showing otherwise. We have Somalia, which is even today is burning. There's fighting going on in the cities. So the fact that is there is also a reality. So we should look at prevention, but at the same time, how do we manage it when it is there? And another thing is that international humanitarian law also obliges us to conform or to conduct operations in a certain manner, and talks about the nature of weapons and so on. So that's why actually my argument was that when you discuss fighting in cities or wars in cities, if you look at the African context, it's not like the context where you have fighting in cities where you have a developed world, a military and a non-developed military, because whereas Israel can target a single moving car and hit it, it may not be possible with a number of African militaries because they lack certain capabilities. And when you hit now civilians, that's where international humanitarian law comes in, the principles of distinction, the principles of proportionality, and that's what I was trying to bring out, that actual African militaries in most cases are not yet there. But that does not mean that, again, it is a justification but it shows how the difficulties in complying with the international humanitarian law. And that's why I was actually outlining them as just challenges that we do face. There is also a lady who asked a question about helping civilians to protect themselves. This is an interesting question because even in the peacekeeping, where you have the so-called peacekeeper and maybe the other side. For sure, you can have peacekeepers in Darfur protecting civilians. That is their work. But it is not likely that these peacekeepers will be everywhere. And we know very well that every society has survival mechanisms, the way they can protect themselves. So if you can help that society also to revive their systems and be able to protect themselves, it's very important. For example, if you go to Gaza, people will tell you, for example, they will know when to go into the bunkers when they strike. So in some societies, they will know when to go to school, whether you go to school in the evening, at night, or during the day, when the time for going to the market. So all these are things that, if you look at various conflicts, societies have their own survival mechanism, which, if we help them, they can be refined. But in addition, we are being also requested by international humanitarian law to give a warning. Apparently, that may also look very, very queer if you tell some people. But the idea that before you strike a place, make sure that those people, you are even before you attack. So that again is going to compromise the element of surprise, which is an important element in war. But again, some militaries are able to do it because, for example, if you can have complete air supremacy over a city, then you can afford not to surprise them because you have those assets. You can be monitoring every move. But I don't think that many people will find it very easy to first warn that you are going to attack because, again, but I also brought those ones as challenges. I think those are questions that you asked me.
Yes, I don't know if you have a comment. I didn't hear specific questions about infrastructure. I think they are still digesting. I'm going to take a last row of questions, starting by Mrs. Barikungeri there. I'm seeing somebody, 2, 3, 4, and the last one. You have already, Dr. Ndushabandi, I've seen you. Mrs. Barikungeri, can you start?
Yes, thank you so much, Alice. Let me also join the earlier speakers to say thank you so much for our able panelists who managed to bring in different perspectives to really help us get into the conversation around war in cities, an African perspective. My name is Mary. I'm the director and founder of the Rwanda Women's Network. It's very important for me as a woman who comes from a women's organization also to begin to reflect around the impact of wars in cities, in the urban areas around women. It's not a secret. They are the most affected. And unfortunately, among all speakers, I didn't feel that was really a subject coming on board. But let me hope, especially to Adama, who is so much at that global space, will always, back of your mind, feel that women matter a lot, because actually even the backbone of our societies. So, but my 2 questions I want to bring across is to the ICRC, Julien, and also to Adama. To Julien, I must say that I probably was the last person to understand that ICRC has traditionally been known to be a more or less a social protection institution.
My sister, if you don't go to the point,
I'm getting to the point, the social protection aspect. But I'm seeing it's so much into development now. If you could tell us how you hope to continue to diversify that social protection agenda of ICRC while you are actually bringing in the whole aspect of family reunification, because that's what you're very best known of, and how you're linking all that to the water, the long-term development that you're really you showed us there. Is it the agenda still there? And so in that social protection, also try to elaborate on the prevention aspect, because I think that's our best. You would be known if you get into
Thank you,
long
Mary.
term. And to Adama, I haven't finished. To Adama, I can't just leave you to go without updating us where we are on the whole notion of social responsibility. Responsibility to protect is a key element in all this. We need to hear globally, how are we holding our governments, others, around the issues of responsibility? Because some of these African governments are the ones who are actually causing harm to their citizens instead of protecting them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. I saw somebody, yes, please? To the back.
Okay, thank you very much.
No,
I will say...
Excuse me. After you, there on the back, is the person who asked for, yes, thank you. Yes, you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Nagaba Wycliffe. My question is addressed to Mr. Dieng.
Very briefly.
Yeah. Most of the talk here has been about state armed forces and vis-a-vis organized armed groups. But there is another aspect of actors who they're in between state armed forces and non-state actors, that is private military firms, private military companies. So there has been a lot of debate about them, their status, their responsibility towards IHL, and they have most of the times, like in conflicts like in Iraq or Syria.
Your question, please.
My question is, what is the policy of the UN towards the status of private military companies? And is there a way of holding corporate structures liable for violations of IHL under the UN? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ndushabandi.
Thank you, moderator, and thank you for panelists. My question come back to the community-led security mechanisms and private companies as the security providers. How to rethink or to think the role of those community-led security mechanisms. Rwanda has a very, very interesting case, and cities are going in this direction. But linking up with humanitarian action, two ideas come to my mind. One, it works when the state is enough strong and has the authority on police and the military bodies. But when the state is weak, how community-led security mechanism can work and the private companies can work effectively in new dynamics of war in cities. So I could go back to the Colonel Gilles Taremara and maybe begging Adama Dieng if he has experience on this community-led security mechanism.
Thank you for your question. Yes, thank you very much. Then the gentleman in the middle who spoke, yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much, panelists. I'm Innocent Diayo-Imana. My just simple question is goes to Adama Dieng. Sir, what can be done so as to restore the authority of deterrent institutions such as the International Criminal Court? Because that is very important in terms of compliance or non-compliance. Non-compliance, then people or those leaders of rebel groups will be tried. But this time around, there's a need to restore its authority, even its image. The other one is just the issue of strengthening regional intergovernmental organizations. If you look at these issues around in Africa, look at the case of Gambia, what was going to happen, but due to ECOWAS, the intervention of ECOWAS, it happened, then Yahya Jammeh went to exile, and the conflict ended peacefully. When the conflict started in Burundi, we thought the East Africa community was going to do something, but so far, nothing has been done. So there's a need to strengthen the authority and also to make sure that regional institutions are totally strengthened so as to deal with those evolving conflict regionally and even internationally. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. The very last question, our privileged lady, since my sister Mary Barikungeri is here, she will hold me accountable. Yes, a last burning question? Yes, a gentleman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Faustin Bagabo from University of Rwanda. I'm asking my question to Mr. Adama Dieng. My question goes to the role of UN vis-à-vis the veto powers of the states that have veto powers in terms of prevention when they have political interest in the states where we have war. So far, what are the measures that UN has over political interests that lead to non-prevention of wars in African countries or elsewhere in the world? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to turn once again to the panel, starting by Mr. Lesourd. And we have only 6 minutes to answer those questions. The rest will be done while we're having our drink and cocktail there. Thank you. Please, Monsieur Lesourd.
Okay, I'll try to be very brief. Just for the question, if I understand well, the question was to know whether our activities in the water field would be done at the expense of other activities. It's completely not the case. Our purpose in ICRC is to provide, I would say, comprehensive and integrated response to the various problems affecting the populations which are victims of the conflict. Water projects have been ongoing for the last 30 years. So I think so far we've managed to develop and work on all topics, including those relating to protection, as you were mentioning, restoring family links and so on. It's part of a whole, and I think everything goes together.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Kano Rutarimara. I think there's a direct question asked also by Dr. Ndushabandi about community security as an interesting answer, probably to a follow-up to the question of Mrs. Murerwa, and what does it happen when you have a weak state? Because from his understanding, it can work in strong states.
Yeah, it's actually true because, okay, the question that was raised was about community-led security mechanism. I think it's a good practice that is related to governance. And I want first to go back and say, I think the problem we are discussing here, the issue of wars and cities, I do not believe that the development of any city goes with the war or brings about war. I think this should be made clear. But it's a question of governance that is actually a big problem. Otherwise, you can have a city expanding, but at the same time, the city remains secure. It's just like an argument people have been having that some countries are too big. That, for example, if you want security in a DRC, you better divide it and have a smaller DRC. But you know very well that China is governable, USA is governable. So the issue is actually not size. Similarly, when you talk about security, I mean what you called community-led security mechanism, it's actually good. But in a weak state, the problem with weak states is that, first of all, they are characterized by, among other things, ungoverned spaces or governance deficit. And this sometimes also is related to development. If you don't have, first of all, effective governance and you don't have effective infrastructure, then you will have a weak state. And because those are characteristics of a weak state, it's actually not easy to to govern those states. That's why I was talking about issues like slums, cities without infrastructure, and with the big populations. If you have been to some slums, like, for example, Kibera in Nairobi or Mazare Street in Nairobi, there is a lot of ungoverned spaces, which are actually no-go area even for police. There are no roads going there. Police does not reach in some areas, and that's very dangerous when it comes to the same actually happens in cities like Rio de Janeiro in Brazil and so on. So here I think we should emphasize on governance, but again involving people to manage their own security is positive, but should go with other factors also. But that is also a part of effective governance.
Thank you very much. Sorry? No, the issue of non-state actors and the link, the private security, I know that part of it has been asked to Mr. Adama Dieng, but Dr. Ndushabandi has also asked about the role of community services and the role of private sector, military, private forces engaged in wars in cities.
Well, again, I think I'm coming back to the issue of management. There are some private security companies, I believe that's what you're talking about. Yeah, in some places, private security companies do work which is supposed to be done by even the state. So I think it varies from one country to another. For example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we have private security companies actually replacing the state to manage, to provide security in mining areas. These things do happen. So where the state is weak, you will find that the private security organs are even taking over the role of what the national security organs are supposed to be doing. So it goes back to how are these private security organs structured, how are they managed, effectively managed, but how are laws governing them, how are they? But with good governance, you can have national militaries, you can have private security organs, as long as they know their boundaries, as long as there are laws governing them, and as long as they will respect those boundaries. But I think where the state is weak, again, they end up taking over roles that they are not supposed to be doing. And that may be a security risk also.
Yes, that covers the question of the blurring non-state actors that was asked before. Yes, I'm going to turn to you. And I want to say also that concerning the question of Meribari Kungeri about sexual violence, Kano Rutaremara has alluded to that as a systematic weapon now used in many conflicts initially. Yes, I'll pass them to you on the issue of governance.
On the issue of governance.
Because it came up very much, and this is something you discussed partly.
Yes.
Yes. So if you can elaborate on that.
Yes, I think I'll come from what just Adama Dieng said, that one of the best way of preventing conflict in urban areas in Africa or even the countries is to set up governance. But at the same time, you can be, let's say, pessimistic if we see what is happening around the continent. But also, I think there is some indication that things are changing a bit. Not necessarily in a linear manner, meaning that it's a protest and then there is a improvement of governance. But sometimes it comes also through conflict, through riots, through protests, and sometimes violent. And maybe also violence also is a tool of historical change. And I really think that's what's going to witness in Africa in the coming years, meaning that this improvement of governance will not come easily and might come from hard pressure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. to you, sir. You had questions, including some have been covered, but mostly the question of the veto and political interest and prevention. How do you relate to that? And also the framework for dealing with private military companies that have spread since the Gulf War, particularly, and have taken up with Africa. But we know that Africa has also an older experience of mercenaries. Now we call them very nicely private military companies, but these are the Bob Denard of the time. Yes? Can you please?
You responded already to the question. I was going to address it through that angle of the mercenaries, which I have studied before. I published many articles on that issue. But I think we need still to be very vigilant, on this issue. The mercenaries are still operating, so we have to be very careful. And then on the question of the veto, what I can say is that the Syria crisis did lead to an outcry from the civil society, and which led some governments to table a proposal, an initiative regarding the use of the veto. In other words, members of the Security Council should refrain using their veto power whenever there is a situation where populations are facing a risk of a genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. It has not yet succeeded, and I doubt that it will be the case. I think there are strong opposition from some members of the Council. And that led finally also, at the level of the General Assembly, a group of states, and as of today, I think there are 124 member states which have signed that initiative, also relating to the use of the veto. It's a kind of a code of conduct for members of the Security Council. And I should say, personally, it is very important that the veto be used for what it has to be used, not for preventing people to be protected when they are facing such serious crimes. And that's where, responding to the question of Mary on Africa and R2P, I should say that Africa didn't wait 2005 when the world leaders met in New York, drawing lessons of their failure in Rwanda and Srebrenica to adopt the principles of R2P. And because simply, at the time of the adoption of its own constitutive act, the African Union leaders also drawing lessons of their failure here in Rwanda, because they failed also to protect the Rwandan population against Rwandan Tutsis who were targeted to prevent the genocide here. They failed, and they decided to adopt Article 4H. But still, they are continuing to fail to address, because we are seeing very serious situation. South Sudan is an example. Okay, they have used some possibilities they had. For instance, even to send a commission of inquiry led by Obasanjo, to decide that they will establish an African Union hybrid court, but still they have not been able to implement it. So to my view, there is sometimes a lack of really determination from many African leaders, and not to say also the game of some regional players. You have in the region, and regarding South Sudan, IGAD, which has a responsibility in charge of that case. Like in ECOWAS, in the case of Gambia, ECOWAS was very determined, and they succeeded. But unfortunately, in the case of South Sudan, IGAD didn't have the same determination. And in the case of Burundi, the East African didn't have the same determination, certainly because some of the leaders in those two regions have also maybe issues at stake, to not say maybe some kind of agenda. They are, but to my view, the protection of the people should be first and foremost a priority. And that is why, when I mentioned in my preliminary remarks that women and children are the first victims, and also today, Secretary General Guterres has decided that you cannot also prevent without involving the woman in the research of solutions. And that's why ROSE is being developed to have women mediators, because we need to get women to play that critical role. I thank you.
Thank you very much. At this point of time, I recognize very well that we still have many questions, and that the conversations led by our eminent panelists have provoked even more questions than what you brought in this room. And luckily, we'll have some extension in the form of having a cocktail outside and continue them. And at this point, I think we'll call it a day, and then vibrantly thank our superb panelists. Join me in thanking them. You have had the privilege this afternoon to discuss issues that we are already living, but which are for our future. And as Joël Germanier said in the beginning, this is just a first step to more discussions of African perspectives on wars and cities. You have known it, you know it even better now that wars in cities are not new. As back as Carthago in before the Christian era, we know that the Roman Empire has steadily called for the destruction of Carthago. Those who have studied Latin know the land that Carthago est. So it has been a target already in that time. What is happening here and what the conversations we had today show is that there is definitely an enhancement. This enhancement comes from the demographics. We have more and more people living in cities, and we have more and more youngsters that we haven't been necessarily able to turn in stakeholders of peace. And this combination with the availability of means of distraction by more and more people after as one of the consequences of the Cold War is also provoking turning our cities and cities to become in a battlefield. It has also shown the blurring part between peace, that is called by students of peace research as a negative peace, immediate cessation of conflict, as well as positive peace, lasting aspect that should be put in place. All that raise new questions. What does it mean? What counts as wars in city? Can we say that today riots also count as war in cities? Can we say today that hate speech, war in social media, counts also as war? And what does it mean in terms of prevention? All of the panelists have more or less alluded to the needs for better governance as a way to prevent, and better governance as a way to conduct wars in responsible manner when it is not possible to avoid war. All those questions will, I hope, lead to thesis for students of the School of Law who's here, under the leadership of the dean here, Dr. Uwe Bana. All of that also raise questions in terms of policy and other books. will go with the master words that Kimonyo has lent us, will transform or will perish. Thank you very much for your kind attention. And please feel free to network and to meet each other around the cocktail offer by the. Thank you very much.